My name is Lauren Paulus, and I'm an immigration attorney and the owner of Paulus Immigration. Today we're going to talk about 3 ways that an individual born outside the United States can acquire U.S. citizenship through one or both of their parents. First, we'll talk about the 3 different alternatives for acquiring U.S. citizenship through a parent. And second, we'll talk about the forms and documents necessary to submit a request for a certificate of citizenship or a passport. Before we talk about the different categories, it's important to note that the law in this area has changed multiple times over the years. So when looking at your case, you have to look at the year in which you were born and the applicable law at that time. Today I'm going to talk about 2 different categories of the law that are going to be most relevant to people who are alive and trying to get certificates of citizenship in this day and age. So that is going to be the law that applied to people who were born between December 24th, 1952 and November 14th, 1986, and then the law that applies to people born on or after November 14th, 1986. So first, what are the 3 alternative ways to acquire U.S. citizenship through a parent? First, an individual can acquire U.S. citizenship through a parent if both parents were U.S. citizens at the time the individual was born, and at least one of those parents had lived in the United States at any time. That section of the law applies evenly to anyone born on or after December 24th, 1952. So both of the categories that I talked about. The second alternative is for individuals who have one parent who was a U.S. citizen at the time they were born and one parent who was a U.S. national at the time they were born. A U.S. national is a person born in either American Samoa or the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, both of which are territories of the United States. In this case, the U.S. citizen parent must have resided either lawfully or unlawfully in the United States for at least 1 year before the child was born. This section of the law applies to both groups as well, so anybody who was born on or after December 24th, 1952. Now this third alternative is where the groups break up. So in this scenario, an individual who had one U.S. citizen parent at the time of their birth may be eligible for U.S. citizenship abroad, for acquiring U.S. citizenship abroad. In this case, for individuals who were born between December 24th, 1952 and November 14th, 1986, the U.S. citizen parent must have resided either lawfully or unlawfully in the United States for a period of 10 years before their child was born, and 5 of those years have to have been after the parent turned 14 years old. Now, for individuals who were born on or after November 14th, 1986, the parent must have resided in the United States either lawfully or unlawfully for 5 years before their child was born, and 2 of those years have to have been after the age of 14. So, if you find that you meet one of these requirements, you'll still need to look at a couple other areas of the law that might apply to you that are kind of more specifics. Like, for example, if the person was born out of wedlock, i.e. the parents were not married at the time, there are some additional requirements to proving that the valid parent-child relationship exists. And also, sometimes I have an individual who comes to me and says, my parent wasn't a U.S. citizen, but my grandma was a U.S. citizen. Is there a way that she could pass citizenship on to me? The answer to that question is maybe. I have had a case in the past where the client came to me, her grandma was a U.S. citizen, but her dad was not a U.S. citizen, so she didn't acquire it directly through her dad, she thought. What we ended up doing was showing that the grandmother met all of the requirements to pass U.S. citizenship on to her son, my client's father, at the time he was born. And then we went and showed that he met all the requirements of residence and all of that to pass it on to his daughter, my client, at the time she was born. So it was kind of a two-step process where we had to first prove that the dad acquired U.S. citizenship, and then we were able to prove that the daughter acquired U.S. citizenship. So it's a great idea to go back through your family tree and see if there's somebody along that direct line that was a U.S. citizen and who maybe met the requirements. So now that we've looked at all the alternatives and the requirements, what are the required forms and documentation for requesting your certificate of citizenship? So the main form for requesting a certificate of citizenship with the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Service, or USCIS, is the N600 form. And you can find this form at USCIS's website. I recommend that even if you're going to hire an attorney to help you, which I think is a great idea, you should still look at the form online and get an idea of the questions and kind of the way the form is set up, so that when you're working with your attorney, you're better able to give them the information they need, and you have a better understanding of the requirements of your case. Now, what are the documents you need? So first, you'll need to prove the parent-child relationship. And you're going to probably do that by using your birth certificate. And if the birth was out of wedlock, your parents weren't married, you may need to acquire some additional documentation. And you should really speak to an attorney about that if that situation applies to you. But it might include DNA records. It may be something more simple, like showing your parents later married, or you have other siblings with the same parents. But it is going to get a little more complicated to show the parent-child relationship if your parents weren't married, and especially if you're acquiring it through your father. But in general, birth certificate will make the cut. And then the next thing you'll want to prove is that your parent was a U.S. citizen at the time you were born. So this will usually take the form of a copy of your parent's passport, your parent's certificate of citizenship, or your parent's U.S. birth certificate, if they have that. And in the case of my client that I talked about earlier, where we were going through the line, her father obviously didn't have that because we hadn't proved yet that he was a citizen. So we just kind of submitted both applications together to show that, you know, we're proving that dad is a citizen, and then that was proof enough to prove that the client had met the requirements to have a U.S. citizen parent. Then the next thing you're going to need to prove is that your U.S. citizen parent met the residence requirements in the United States. So for the first alternative, it was just that one of the U.S. citizen parents had been in the U.S. for any time. So that might just, you might just have a stamp in their passport showing they came into the U.S. in that case. In the second alternative, where you had a U.S. citizen parent and a national parent, you had to show 1 year of residence. So in that case, you're going to need a little more evidence. It might be school transcripts, it might be medical records, it might be stamps in the passport again, anything showing your parent was here for that full year. And then in the last category, where we're looking at either 10 years or 5 years of residence in the United States, you're going to need more documentation. You'll want, usually I recommend something from about every 3 months of every year. So if your parent was supposedly here for 10 years, the best thing to do is try and get about 3 or 4 documents from each of those 10 years. Sometimes things like school transcripts are enough and really good indicators. That's just one document, but it's going to have years and years of proof that the person was here. Another good thing are Social Security records, tax returns, rent receipts, bank records, medical records. These are all examples of documents you can use to show that your parent was in the United States for the required amount of time. And don't forget that you do have to meet the requirement for after the parent turned 14 in that last category. So when you're looking at school transcripts, make sure that those apply to some of the years after 14 if they're available. And as I mentioned earlier, the residence in the United States doesn't have to be lawful. It can be unlawful. So that's not something we're worried about at this stage. We're just proving that they were here physically in the United States for the required amount of time. Okay, so now we've talked about the 3 different ways an individual can acquire U.S. citizenship through a parent, and the forms and documentation you should begin gathering for your case. As always, I highly recommend that you hire an attorney to help you. The law can be very complicated, and it's good to have the guidance of somebody who specializes in immigration law, guiding you through the process and also making those important communications with the immigration officers. If you have any questions or concerns, please do not hesitate to contact me at Paulus Immigration. The phone number is 202-709-6439, and the website is www.paulusimmigration.com. Thank you and good luck.